Good morning and welcome to the session on violence against women statistics, better monitoring and communicating complex data and trends. This is a follow-up section from last UNFPA Forum 2020 that we organized with UNFPA last year, and again we are proposing you new topics. The section last time was organized also thanks to Arietta Jensen, that is one of our important speakers. Today we have 5 important speakers that give us an overview of the advancement in measuring the topic from several perspectives, several issues that are presented to you, but also that give us a glance to the pandemic period that is very challenging and asking us new efforts for the measurement and the dissemination of data. I have to add that you are welcome to ask questions, obviously in our presence, for people present, and by chat. And then we will going to answer. If we didn't have time, we will do later. So the session will be open virtually. The first speaker is Cristina Fabre, and she will speak us about measuring femicide, a classification system. Cristina Fabre is a team leader on gender-based violence program at the European Institute for Gender Equality. She is project manager of studies related to administrative data collection on specific forms of gender-based violence, on advancing measurements, and on the conceptual framework of violence. Cristina, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I hear an echo. Thanks a lot, Jurzi. Femicide, as you know, is rare compared to other forms of violence against women and girls, but it remains a common focus of data collection. This is because we think that data on femicide is easy to collect and it's easy to record, and it's less affected by some biases regarding the recording. But we see that this is not the case in all the countries, and mainly it's not the case for all groups of women and girls. However, compared to other forms of gender-based violence, femicide data allows us for a better documentation of the cases, the characteristics of the incidents, and also the characteristics of the victims and perpetrators. This can lead to a more informed intervention and prevention initiative, as well as within the country and across country, a monitor assessment of the trends and to monitor emerging priorities. Though the data on femicide is more available than in other forms of gender-based violence, we will see that we are still far from documenting femicide in a reliable manner. Despite the attention given to femicide, there's still not a agreed definition on femicide, and there's still not an agreement on how we can operationalize the differences between homicide and femicide. The term femicide means the killing of women and girls on account of their gender, but how we can operationalize this on account of their gender? There are different approaches to define and identify femicide. In some countries, mainly in Latin America, they have established femicide or feminicide as a crime in their criminal codes. And in the European Union, we are using 2 main approaches. One is just to check or to analyze the aggravating factors that are identified during the criminal proceedings. And for instance, that if the killing was committed by a spouse or an intimate partner, or if the victim was pregnant. In some countries, they have also included in their criminal laws like other elements as aggravating factors that are, for instance, misogyny, sexism, gender, hate, and honor. The third approach, and it's the most used or taken by many EU member states, is that to use the gender-neutral criminal law provision on homicide, murder, or manslaughter. Therefore, administrative records of homicides often do not capture the information of the gender-related killing. In many cases, there are no disaggregated data by sex and by other data that allows us to capture other information related to the context and circumstances of the crime. EIGE just conducted an assessment of the EU member states on how they are gathering administrative data on femicide, and the most common database used is the police data, followed by court data, criminal data, and health data. Only six member states use information from different data sources. Those are the member states that conduct domestic homicide reviews or that have established femicide observatories or femicide watches. We also saw that there are 18 member states that gather non-official data, mainly based on the media analysis, and these non-official sources are run by NGOs or research institutes. But if we see that when analyzing the official data source, there are almost no information sharing, there are no coordination between the different institutions. When we are analyzing the information sharing between official and non-official sources, we see that this is practically non-existent. So we see that the data has a lot of limitations. Mainly data is limited in scope, so they are only collecting the information in specific circumstances, like when the woman is killed by an intimate partner or by a family member, so leaving out other circumstances and context of the crime, and the data is mainly incomplete. So there are only few member states that collect variables and data that can allow to capture the gender dimension of the crime. Data is also incomplete and not particularly accurate, based on also because of the lack of the training of the data collectors from the criminal sector. The data on motives of the homicide, and most of the time also about the specific relationship between the victim and perpetrators, are missing from the databases. Also, we see that most of the data is not accessible to the researchers, and also sometimes is not accessible even to the policymakers. The comparability of data is important to see the trends within and across countries, but making data comparable across countries and across institutions in the same countries is a difficult task. EIGE conducted a data collection in 2019 and 2020 on the intimate partner femicide, and the indicator was women victims of intimate femicide age 18 and over committed by male intimate partner age 18 and over. And we saw that 24 EU member states had data available, but data was comparable only in 14 member states, mainly because sex of the perpetrator is almost missing, and only 14 member states had data on their relationship. So we saw that different situations that could be categorized as gender motivated were leaving out due to the lack of data. So in order to expand our measurement to include other types of femicide, EIGE conducted a 3-steps project. The first one was to assess the data available at the EU member state level, so which are the variables gathered in each one of the data sources. Then the next step was to look at the theoretical frameworks of and types of femicide that were identified by the research and the literature review, and consider the different descriptive variables that were suggested by the research and the literature. We look at which of those those variables were also used and at national data sources that allow them to assign to different types of femicide. This led to a classification system of different types of femicide by assigning different items to the variables and suggesting important combinations of these items that are significant to different types of femicide. Based on this methodology, EIGE proposes to measure these specific forms of femicide that we believe that member states are able, some of the member states are able to really to produce these statistics based on the variables that are already in place in their databases. So mainly this is our classification is that intimate partner femicide, family-related femicide, including honor killing and only-related killings, other types of intentional homicides, that killings that involve sexualized violence, sexual exploitation, trafficking related, and also context that implies a continuum of violence in particular settings, and including also the age of the victim. So women age 65 and over killed by non-intimate or non-family members. We are also aiming at measuring non-intentional, let's say, killings of women that are the FGM-related death and the death of a woman resulting from intimate partner violence. The aim is to expand the data collection on different forms of femicide, and in doing so, we also hope that we are helping or supporting the member states to better collect data on other forms of gender-based violence. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you to you, Cristina, for this important presentation about this challenging classification system, because it represents one of the first steps to study femicide in countries, at least in Europe, a complex phenomenon that is complex since its definition, as we have just heard. And also thanks to the harmonization that will be an essential tool to have comparable data between countries on femicide measurement. And now it is a pleasure to present to you Andres Vicat, that will speaks us about measuring the impact of a COVID pandemic on women and men. This is also a new topic, and Andres Vicat, that is an in-person speaker, work at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, as a chief of the Social Demographic Statistics section. Work under his responsibility includes the development of guidelines on statistical methodology, building national statistical capacity, and measuring progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Andres, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giusy, for the introduction. Well, I'm going to talk about the measurement of violence against women in the context of a broader effort to guide statistical offices in measuring the impact of the COVID pandemic on women and men. And my organization, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, covers 56 countries in Europe, North America, and Central Asia, and many countries from other parts of the world participate in its work under the Conference of European Statisticians. When the pandemic broke out and confinement measures started, switch the slide now. Then there were a lot of anecdotal evidence of how women and men were differently affected. And at first, hard evidence was hard to come by, but common sense observations were rather obvious that women in the front line as nurses and carers, women affected by the increasing unpaid care burden, and gradually various statistics started to come in, revealing, among others, that more men are dying from the disease than women, and that the hospitality industries, where most of the staff are women, were among those that took the hardest hit. And you can see a selection of headlines as more systematic analysis started to come in by the agencies, among others the UN Women, talking about the shadow pandemic of violence. So statisticians, of course, need to measure all this properly. And they have to consider that the COVID pandemic has potential to reverse gains in gender equality and the empowerment of women. Also, that the social and economic impacts are likely to persist beyond the duration of the pandemic itself. And relevant gender statistics are required now to monitor ongoing and long-term impact and devise the gender-responsive policies. In September 2020, UNFPA conducted a survey among national statistical offices to understand where exactly the demands and challenges are that they face. And a team of experts under the UNFPA steering group on gender statistics had already started to develop practical guidance for producers towards measurement of gender and impact of the pandemic. So the survey brought in the specific concerns and led the group to the selection of topics which are listed in this slide: work, health, and in particular violence against women as one topic, but also a relatively new topic of the digital gender divide. Is not entirely new, but it certainly surfaced with higher prominence during the pandemic. So in that guidance, which was developed by the group, there is an overview given on each topic why it is important, a set of indicators defined for the specific pandemic period to measure the impact of the pandemic, and the survey questions that statistical offices can go and use in their regular surveys. It was not proposed to do a special COVID survey. It was proposed to do some modifications in existing surveys. And of course, there are methodological notes as to how frequently these data are needed and what is the most suitable so-called parent survey where the new questions should be adopted. And also the guidance includes a short explanation on the policy relevance of each topic. So let me just briefly show what was decided on violence against women. Well, dedicated surveys are the best tools to measure and monitor violence against women. This is well known, but if countries are not able to carry them out due to the lack of resources or for other reasons, a well-designed module on violence will also be important to have. So the obvious concern is that during the pandemic it is difficult to conduct population surveys, both from an operational point of view as well as from the point of view of concerns to the women's safety, since partners and other abusive family members may be at home more often than in other periods. And we had actually quite good discussions about this topic in two Road to Bern events that just preceded this forum last week at the meeting of the UNEC group of experts on gender statistics, as well as at the Global Forum on Gender Statistics. So we know also that the overall conceptual basis for indicators on violence against women is very well established. So there is a need to anchor in those indicators and see what extra issues can come up. This slide shows the 8 indicators proposed for measuring the impact of the pandemic on violence against women. You see that they are related to conflicts in the household, suffering violence from intimate partner, other family member or relative, suffering cyber violence, accessing services, reasons for not accessing services, and children witnessing or suffering violence. The reference period is, in these cases, generally since the onset of the pandemic, and this needs to be modified as time passes and in the pandemic, and several surveys may be taken during the pandemic. And the guidance also proposes questions for inclusion in regularly conducted surveys, so the suggested data collection frequency is annual or according to the usual frequency of the parent survey. So by design, administrative sources, of course, allow a quicker reaction. Their shortcomings are well known, but at the time when surveying is especially difficult and changes are quick, they would be the first source ensuring transition from anecdotal evidence to solid data. And the guidance provides a quite extensive package of material on this. There are 3 indicators on the prevalence of homicides, 6 on the access to and uptake of support services, and further 6 on capacity of national and local governments to provide protection for women experiencing violence. Sources include police statistics, anti-violence crisis centers, residential shelters, and helplines. And in the same way as there are specifically worded survey questions, there are also specifically identified variables that would have to be collected from those authorities to enable the calculation of the indicators. Well, the part of the guidance pertaining to violence against women has been developed relying on the Italian example mainly. Many of you may know that the Italian National Statistical Institute is well advanced in dealing with this matter, and actually Giusy Muratore, who is moderating us today, has been a leading expert behind that part of the guidance. So what is going to happen next? There is going to be a review by the Conference of European Statisticians Bureau in October. Actually, next week it will already take place. Countries will be invited there to test and use these survey questions and the indicators in their regular statistical data collection and production. And we expect, of course, updates to occur as more countries are going to test these recommendations in practice. So measuring the impact of the pandemic is clearly not a rapid assessment process only. There are certain needs that require really quick new information, but then about the impact, it is necessary to understand what it brings in the medium and long term. And that guidance document is really mainly geared towards that, to consolidate the experience that countries gain in maintaining and in looking into the question. So finally, let me also give credits to the entire group of experts from national statistical offices who have been developing the guidance based on the experience of their work and during the pandemic. So thank you all, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andres, really. Thank you. And also because now you give the idea of this impressive project on the guidelines on measuring the impact of COVID. For violence, we can say that the COVID represents an emergency in the emergency, and also obviously for other important topics. But it is very important that for these guidelines give us the possibility to have a rich and interesting framework that put together different kind of topics, and in this way represents a good way, also a good approach for the women empowerment, also looking at a different perspective that can be also merged. So thank you very much, and good luck for the prosecution of the work with the SES Bureau. And now it is a pleasure to present to you Christine Diemer, our third speaker, that present a direct experiment, a concrete situation in which it is implemented, some guidelines and a course and a survey during this period on the impact of COVID. In fact, she will speak us about the impact of COVID on violence against women data collection, and on of the kNOwVAWdata course adaptation and delivery. And Christine Diemer is an associate professor in sociology at the University of Melbourne. In collaboration with the UNFPA Asia Pacific and Australian DAFT, she co-leads the kNOwVAWdata course on for building global capacity to measure violence against women. In addition, she works with multi-indicator administrative data trend and analysis. And Christine from Australia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Violence against women is increasingly recognized as a detrimental public health and human rights epidemic with both social and economic consequences. And quantifying and understanding exactly how violence against women manifests in countries is difficult. The only way to understand the full scale and magnitude of the problem is through prevalence surveys. Today, I'll talk about the ＫNOwVAWdata initiative, and KNOwVAWdata stands for without knowing the data, we can't end violence against women in the acronym. So without the KNOwVAWdata initiative, and especially the course, which is working to improve the technical ability for countries to accurately, reliably, and comparably measure violence against women. With SDG target 5.2 and its dedicated indicators on violence against women, the demand for prevalence data is increasing. To measure progress towards this goal, countries need skills to safely and accurately collect violence against women prevalence data. But because of a lack of technical capacity to do so, there remains a substantial lack of ethically and statistically sound prevalence data. The KNOwVAWdata initiative, conceptualized by Henriette Jensen, is changing that and works towards measurement of several development goals directly and indirectly. Henriette will be speaking later in this session, looking in depth at some specific prevalence data. I want to highlight this flagship product, the UNFPA Map and Balls, that we update every year. It reflects the most recent data in intimate partner violence from the 32 countries in Asia and Pacific where surveys have been done with one of the two gold standard methodologies, either the World Health Organization multi-country study or the domestic violence module of the Demographic and Health Survey. We use this tool a lot and in many different ways to tell the stories of diversity of the experiences of women in the subregions and the dynamics of violence by comparing the relative difference between lifetime prevalence, which are indicated by the light brown balls on this illustration, and the last 12 months of prevalence, which are the orange balls. You can see there's a great range of diversity in the prevalence rates, and it's a very strong communication tool. The second pillar, the landmark KNOwVAWdata course, aims to build the skills needed to safely and ethically gather robust and reliable data in difficult and sometimes dangerous conditions. It also builds skills in analyzing, interpreting, communicating, and using results, which are just as important. The curriculum draws from decades of existing materials and resources developed by global experts and uses international best practice standards to support learning of complex and complete research, analysis, and knowledge translation for measuring the prevalence of violence against women. The KNOwVAWdata course was piloted in 2018 as a face-to-face course with a focus on Asia. Again, it was offered in 2019 with a focus on the Pacific region. In 2020, with the onset of the pandemic, most surveys and face-to-face training ceased, and we started translating the course into an online format. To date, we've had 125 people enrolled across 46 countries globally, with 69 so far completed. The course consists of 4 modules and 20 tutorials. The amount of content is the equivalent of 4 weeks full-time intensive study. The length and intensity of the course reflects the seriousness and sensitivity needed for measuring violence against women. Sessions are adapted to reflect the backgrounds, needs, and strengths of each cohort. For example, if participants are particularly interested in measuring violence against women with disabilities, a session may be more heavily dedicated to this. And depending on the demand, the curriculum may be adapted to have a greater focus on other areas of interest, such as administrative data and how that can be used alongside prevalence data, or perhaps measuring prevalence in humanitarian settings. The face-to-face program combines lectures and group learning activities to facilitate practical application of knowledge and skills and peer-to-peer learning. One of the most highly regarded elements of the course is to hear about real-life examples from other colleagues. At the end of the course, participants have produced a full country protocol for conducting violence against women research. We regard the in-person learning as the best model for KNOwVAWdata course, and we've tried to translate the course to an online format while retaining these integral elements. We're still playing around with the learning format to achieve the right balance for optimally engaged online learning. In the spirit of kNOwVAWdata's mission to expand the global skill set for safe and ethical measurement, the kNOwVAWdata course and other course documents have been developed as open source resources for use by other facilitators and trainers. In fact, it's a crucial part of the initiative that the team is actively seeking partners to offer the kNOwVAWdata course at other institutions regionally and across the globe. We emphasize the input of local knowledge so we can adapt the course to meet the needs in those different regions. And at the moment, we're translating into Russian, French, and Spanish. Finally, to sustainably support course participation from priority countries, we're planning to introduce a bursary program in the near future. Amid the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in situations of lockdown or restricted mobility, as Andres pointed out, when women may be at home with their abusers and less able to ask for help, there's anecdotal evidence that violence is changing, becoming more severe, and more women are experiencing violence for the first time. The pandemic has caused an unprecedented interest in collecting data on violence against women to understand the impact of COVID-19. This, however, is not without challenges, as the gold standard ethical and safety recommendations around confidentiality and providing support to respondents who need this cannot easily be achieved under lockdown or restricted movement conditions. To address this, UNFPA's kNOwVAWdata initiative partnered with the World Health Organization and UN Women to develop a decision tree to help people think through decisions about violence against women data collection activities during the pandemic. It gives alternative options when interviewers cannot safely visit homes, and remote methods may jeopardize women's safety. Without providing a safe format for measuring violence, the data will not be reliable and will not be actionable. So while this decision tree may look complex, it's actually very simple, and it fits on an A4 page if you want to print it off. It starts at the top left-hand corner with a reflection question asking the researcher, why do they want to collect the data? And then the user works through a series of additional questions and options, making choices to help identify the most appropriate, ethical, and safe way to gather data under pandemic conditions. This decision tree can also be used under other emergency conditions. The decision tree has been well received, widely shared, and is currently available in 15 languages, with others coming on board and adaptations being made for related areas such as violence against children. You can find the decision tree in all language versions on the UNFPA Asia and the Pacific website. The most important takeaway is that it is our moral and ethical obligation to ensure that the data we are collecting is adding value, that it will be used for the benefit of women, and most importantly, that it's not jeopardizing women's safety. So we always ask, before you start, ask yourself, is this really the best time to be collecting data? What is the motivation for the research? Who will benefit in what way? Are the women at the center? And does the research add value? Will the findings be actionable? And how will you ensure that the findings can be used? In my last slide, we look at how we can measure violence against women under COVID conditions using prevalence surveys when it's safe to do so, again, using the gold standard methods. The most efficient way to do this is to adapt the standard questionnaire slightly to obtain useful data on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The simplest way is to add one question, asking whether the violent acts they experienced remained the same, got worse, or whether the violence started during the pandemic. Now, the next few slides just offer a few references and resources that are available in the slide deck if you get access to that after the conference. And as well, there are ways of locating our kNOwVAWdata initiative resources and materials on the kNOwVAWdata website through the Asia Pacific UNFPA or the knowvawdata.com site, which is for the course. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you very much to you, Kristen, for your interesting presentation. It gave us the possibility to concretely imagine how to use the guidelines It mixes the theoretical approach to measure violence with a concrete aspect and decision to take into account when planning a survey and in a specific context. And the season 3 is very fascinating, and we will obviously certainly follow these interesting aspects. Now I have the pleasure to present to you Lucilla Scarnicchia, that will guide us through the step towards the measurement of violence against women in Italy. And Lucilla Scarnicchia is a researcher at the Italian National Institute of Statistics. She's currently involved in the national data collections related to violence against women, and she works also on the integrated system of information on violence against women. And Lucilla also will present us just some key things regarding the measurement of COVID in Italy. Thank you, Lucilla.
Thank you, Giusy. And thank you to all the attendees for following our session, and special acknowledgements to the colleagues who substantially contributed to this presentation. Yes. A presentation that describes the steps we made in Italy to answer to these two main questions: how to measure violence against women, and how to communicate this complex data. We'll see, the process is not ended, but we are progressively developing what we can call a multi-source approach. That for the first question means the integration of data that come from different data sources. While when we need to communicate the data, the multi-source approach led to the integration of different data results. And we will see more in details how. Many of you already know, but we have to bear in mind that the response to violence against women is fixed by the Istanbul Convention in 3 pillars of interventions. Interventions to prevent the violence, interventions to protect women, setting up specialized support services, and interventions to prosecute the perpetrators, plus a 4th pillar on the integrated policies. Now, following this framework, we built an integrated system of information on violence against women. Because for each pillar we have different data sources and different data collections. And indeed, the data collections can be carried out in several ways. It can be the use of sample surveys, as we do when addressing the prevention, using the Women's Safety Survey and the Citizen Security Survey. But can be also the use of administrative data. Just let's think about the reports to the police. And even the use of big data that we are recently analyzing in the context of stereotypes and attitudes towards violence against women in the social media. But for example, the same topic, this kind of stereotypes, is also addressed in a short dedicated survey. So we really need to integrate all this information and make it understandable. In terms of communication, the result is a dedicated website, partially available also in English, and where all these data are published together with complementary information that make more understandable the data. For example, information on the legal framework, on the ongoing policies, and also reports from other producers of official statistics. And indeed, the website is organized in sections that reflect the Istanbul pillars. And this, we can see some of the data we collect. Here, some of the results from the Women's Safety Survey. We carried out in Italy already twice. Last time was in 2014, while the next edition we will carry it out next year. And next year, so it will be the first time we carried out the survey after the COVID-19 outbreak. In fact, the new edition of the survey will include some specific questions with reference to the pandemic. We see in the first chart that in Italy, 1 woman out of 3 suffer physical or sexual violence during her life. This data is in line with the global average and stayed stable over time. While in the second chart, there are some data changing over time, so considering the rates in the past 5 years. Here in particular, we see the different forms of violence decreasing all over time, except for the most serious forms of violence, as is the rape, that stay stable over time. And this is another aspect, stay stable over time, the risk factors of violence. So based on the survey, the probability for women to suffer violence perpetrated by the intimate partner they have is 5.2%. And this risk doesn't really change according to the characteristics of women, while the risk might increase depending on some habits of the man. Here we see how the risk increases if the man is verbally or physically violent outside the family. The risk is 41% if he's used to belittle the partner, and reaches almost 90% if he gets drunk every day or almost every day. And here I wanted to show you the crucial data from the Ministry of Interior, data on homicides. The first chart, homicide rates in Italy since 2003. And with the two lines, we distinguish in blue, the upper line, the killings of men. You see clearly these killings are decreasing over time in Italy, and this is especially due to the decline of homicides linked to the organized crime. But if we look at the line in red at the bottom, this relates to killings of women, and the situation is different. Killings of women stay stable over time. And these trends are also confirmed after the COVID-19 outbreak. It means with the reference for data about 2020 and what is available for 2021. And this difference between men and women about homicide is confirmed in the second chart, where is highlighted the different kind of perpetrators. So again, in blue, the case where the victim of homicide is a man. And then the most common perpetrator is someone unknown to the victim or an unidentified person. While you see in red the case where the victim of homicide is a woman, and then the most common perpetrator is her intimate partner. And indeed, this share is even increasing from 48 to 61% in the last 10 years. This is an example on how we publish the data on homicide following the multi-source approach. It means including an additional data source, in this case the justice system. So we publish, together with the data on victims from the police, also data on convictions and proceedings from the justice system. And this analysis made possible for the first time in Italy to estimate the number of femicides. So we had 101 femicides in 2019. While here there is a report from another actor involved in fighting violence against women, the Ministry of Health. Briefly, we had in 3 years about 60,000 women accessing the emergency room of hospitals due to violence. And in conclusion, some words about our activities during the pandemic. As recommended, while we weren't able to run again the survey on the prevalence of violence, we enhanced some of the data collections already existing and relating to other aspects of violence, namely the data collections on the requests for help made to the national helpline, the data collections on specialized support services, and data on homicides. And due to the limited time, I can show you only some of the results about the calls to the national helpline. So here, the daily requests for help made by women from January to December since 2018. Each line represents one different year. And in particular, in light blue, we see data referring to 2020. And you see clearly, during that special year, there is an increase of the requests for help. But we have to be careful with this data because this is also the result of a reinforced awareness campaign made especially during the lockdown. In fact, you see the blue line raised during the second quarter of the year. And in Italy, this corresponds to the COVID-19 outbreak and also to the most tight national lockdown. But in fact, if you look at the whole year, the highest peak is at the end. It corresponds to the 25th of November, that is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And this peak happens every year. So you can see it's confirmed the pushing factor by the awareness campaign. But in any case, if we consider the most recent data here in red, what is available for 2021, it's confirmed that the number of requests made during the pandemic that is still ongoing, this number is higher than before the COVID-19 outbreak. So, in conclusion, for sure, we have to take into account this crucial information collected through the calls to the helplines. But it's true that we will know more about what is really happening to women with the results of the next edition of the Women's Safety Survey. That's why I invite you to check our website for the new developments. And I'm say thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you, Lucilla, for having presented this important and formative system that show us how data are important in order to plan and evaluate policies. Different sources and methods are in fact at the basis of the data of good quality. But at the same time, data need to be vehiculated in an easy and understandable way. And stakeholders also need to learn the ways to read and use the data. And it is also very important to conjugate the context and the culture where statisticians and data providers work and act. So thank you very much, Lucilla. And following also a concrete we can say an implementation of studying data, I will present Erika Harriet for us Johnson that present data on violence against women and the marital rape in the Pacific region. Harriet was a technical advisor of violence against women research and data in UNFPA Asia Pacific Regional Office in Bangkok, and initiator and the technical lead of the kNOwVAWdata initiative, a partnership between UNFPA Regional Office for Asia and Pacific, Australian DEFT, and the University of Melbourne that aims to strengthen violence against women data collection in the Asia-Pacific region. Harriet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juicy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. I'm joining you now from Bangkok, from Thailand. I would like to lead you through a journey of finding the story behind data, using data on violence against women and marital rape collected in the Pacific, a region where I have lived and where I was involved in supporting many national violence against women prevalence surveys. Let me start with this quote. Life with my first husband was never good. I can't remember a good time with him. Once he forced me to have sex with him in front of the children. He didn't care. And these are the words from a woman in Cook Islands describing her married life. But they could be the words from women anywhere. Sexual violence in marriage is more common than most people realize. The SDG indicators on intimate partner violence and sexual violence under Goal 5 are monitored using data from surveys where we measure different types of violence and combine them into composite overall prevalence rates. Such surveys produce also data on sexual partner violence and marital rape, which are not commonly looked at as a phenomenon on its own. The concept rape in marriage is complex and varies depending on the cultural context and over time. In many places, marital rape is not legally recognized, and marriage is still often seen as permanent consent. Once entered into a marriage, any sexual interaction that occurs within that relationship is automatically consensual. The 11 surveys on violence against women conducted in the Pacific give us a unique chance to explore and compare violence against women and marital rape, because all surveys were conducted with the same methodology, the methodology developed for the WHO multi-country study on women's health and domestic violence. On this map, I've indicated the three distinct culture areas in the Pacific and the 11 countries for which we have data. That's in Melanesia, Fiji, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, in Micronesia, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Nauru and Palau, and in Polynesia, the Cook Islands, Samoa, and Tonga. And here is a real-life example of how survey data is often used in communication. This headline says, "New report shows that Pacific women suffer alarming levels of violence, among the highest in the world." Well, is this headline correct? And is it useful? Is it helpful for policy? Let's look at the real data underlying this headline and come back to these questions later. The data in this and in the following graphs is grouped according to the 3 subregions, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, with the countries every time in the same order. And this graph shows that in each Pacific Island country, more than 1 in 3 women experience physical and/or sexual violence by either a partner or a non-partner, somebody else than the partner, in their lifetime. And that's higher for every country than the global average. And in most countries, it is at least 2 out of 3. And the lowest prevalence rates are seen in Micronesia and the highest in Polynesia, Samoa and Tonga in this case. Presenting data in this way shows indeed that the situation for women in the Pacific is rampant, but it also gives a false impression that women's experience across the Pacific is rather similar. So here is the same data, but now disaggregated by perpetrator, partners, and non-partners. And these blue bars show the proportion of women experiencing physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And it shows much more variation than we have just seen, with strikingly Samoa and Tonga in Polynesia no longer ranking among the highest. The Melanesian countries on the left and Kiribati have the highest levels of intimate partner violence. Adding in physical violence by others, by non-partners, show a completely different pattern, really strikingly different. And physical non-partner violence is much lower in Melanesia and it's very high in Polynesia. And when we add in sexual violence by others, these green bars, we see that it's relatively high in Melanesia and it's low in Polynesia. So clearly, violence by partners and non-partners is not correlated, and the data suggests rather distinct and consistent patterns, with Melanesian women experiencing extremely high prevalences of intimate partner violence and relatively high rates of sexual non-partner violence, while in contrast, the women in the Polynesian countries are more likely to have experienced physical violence, especially by non-partners, often parents, relatives, and teachers, even higher than intimate partner violence, which is rarely seen anywhere in the world. So this is our context for exploring marital rape. So to do that, we'll zoom into the intimate partner violence, the blue bars, which you see again here, but now broken down by the lifetime experience of only sexual, the gray parts, only physical, the yellow parts, and both types of violence, the orange parts. And this shows us that in the Melanesian countries and Kiribati, most women who experienced intimate partner violence have experienced sexual partner violence, and mostly combined with physical violence. And for Polynesian women, we see the experience of sexual violence is a much smaller part of their experience of intimate partner violence, somehow consistent with what we saw before about non-partner violence. I want to now briefly dive deeper into the only sexual violence component, because that's the marital rape. So the orange and the gray bars, which we now again see here, but now in green. And we add here, this is lifetime sexual partner violence, and we add here sexual violence in the last 12 months. And what is remarkable is that in the countries where more women experience sexual partner violence in the lifetime, relatively more women also experience current or recent sexual violence, which tells us that in these countries, once a woman experiences marital rape, it continues repeatedly and over many years. So we also explored other patterns, and here you see, for example, the distribution of specific acts of violence. but I don't have time to go into that. But this and other patterns that we studied consistently show that there are distinct sub-regional patterns. And these patterns that we saw, we were not aware of those when we saw this first graph, I bring it back, and when we saw the headline. So the big takeaway of the analysis that we did is that overall composite prevalence rates give actually a very limited story, and it can be really misleading to rely on those for your policies. So when we look deeper, we found huge differences in women's experiences across the Pacific, with the Melanesian women experiencing relatively high levels of marital and other sexual violence, suggesting high levels of gendered violence rooted in gender inequality and men's entitlement over women and their bodies. Whereas at the other end, the Polynesian women experienced relatively low levels of sexual violence in and outside marriage in a context of high levels of physical violence, which appear to be, to a large extent, disciplinary in nature. In other words, physical violence was meant to educate women about acceptable behavior. Understanding these patterns caused revolutionary changes in how colleagues in the Pacific now communicate and respond to violence against women in a way that's context-specific. For example, they now realize that an intervention to change gender norm is more relevant for Melanesia than for Polynesia. Indeed, while quantitative data can be very powerful and is able to move silent epidemics into the public view, without deeper analysis, we will not know the real story behind national averages. But there is something else. Without qualitative insights and cross-cultural contextualization, quantitative data alone will never tell us a real good story. And therefore, I want to end with making the case that we should engage with other disciplines and we should make better use of qualitative data hand in hand with quantitative survey data for a better understanding of the issues at stake, which will help us to develop better and effective evidence-based, culturally specific interventions. The presented data with many more details are written up in this book chapter. You find here the link to the book. And I finish with thanking you all for listening.
Thank you, Harriet, especially for you that work since decades on violence against women, innovating methodologies and contents of the survey. And your presentation is really important to underline how it is important to go in depth, to understand what there is behind a number, how to contextualize it, how to read a situation that is more complex than it appears. And I really appreciate your ability to use both qualitative and quantitative methods in order to treat a difficult framework. Thank you very much for all the speakers, and thank you very much for all of you that are present. We have a lot of questions in chat, but I would like to ask you if you have questions for our speakers, and then we can go through the chat questions. Please. Oh, if there are not, yes, there is, two questions. Oh, beautiful.
Hi, I'm Natalie Rothwell from Warwick University. I was just interested to pick up on maybe some of the fear that women have felt around violence because of lockdown, in terms of streets being more empty or just situations changing in terms of transport, and I just wondered if you discussed any of those issues or thought about how to respond to them. Thank you.
Okay. We can collect also the other question, and then we have a tour between speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kristen Jeffers from UNECE. I have a quite direct question for Christina from IGA. I know that the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and UN Women are also working to develop a common statistical framework on femicide. So I was just wondering if IGA is involved in that project, and if not, would they like to collaborate? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I give the floor before to Andres and Lucila, and then to our remote speakers. Thank you.
For this question, that was not to me.
The first
or the other question?
Yes, the other.
For those in the chat.
Yes.
Okay, so there was a question in the chat which I want to highlight about harmonized measurement on violence against women, whether there is anything and whether we have tools for that. We certainly have. I mentioned in the presentation also that there is a well-established conceptual basis. There about 10 years ago, the United Nations Statistical Commission adopted a set of indicators, and there has been a standard questionnaire to measure, to collect the data that allows producing those indicators. So we all know that the WHO has been conducting the multi-country studies for many years, and then based on those questionnaires, these specific survey questions were developed. I know Henriette Jansen was very closely involved in all that work. And therefore, there is a clear way how to measure standardized tools. I am aware also that in translation something may get lost, but generally speaking, there are pretty good and solid instruments available.
Thank you very much. And please, Lucila.
Yes, I would like to reply to your question. Thank you. Yes, it's true with the pandemic. It's in our experience the context of our life changed completely. In streets and empty. We were forced to be home. As we said during this session, the best tool to have information, to gather information about violence against women, stay the survey. The dedicated survey, because then it's possible also to gather information on, first of all, on the kind of perpetrator that of violence, but also where this violence happened, in which context, in which place. But for the moment, please, Giusy, tell me if I'm wrong, because maybe I cannot remember all the details, but also this kind of information is collected through the calls to the national helpline, probably. Yes. So it's a good point. We bear in mind that we are conscious about this this kind of information, crucial, I mean, to understand the phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you. And please, Christina, if you can answer to the question.
Yes. Just one point to the first question, that what we have noticed regarding the data that we are collecting is that even though it's true that during COVID and during the lockdown and the restrictive measures, women fear more to go outside to report violence because, of course, that being stuck in your household with the perpetrator just put them at more risk. But when we are analyzing data on femicide, then the femicide rates just increased after the lockdown. So when the perpetrator just had this the feeling that that this control that he thought that he had over her partner and the family did not continue after the lockdown, then the femicide cases rates increased in some of the countries that we are kind of following the data. So we need to have data during the lockdown, previous the lockdown, and after the lockdown to see, which are the women's experience, because that we've seen that after the lockdown, the ones that were suffering the more severe form of violence were more at risk than during the lockdown. So the previous speakers were saying that we need the qualitative data also to understand women's experience. So only through administrative data, it's very difficult to really understand, that we can identify some risk factors, but to really understand the feelings and the safety or the risk feelings, we need qualitative data. And regarding the question on the EIGE being part of this UNODC, UN Women initiative on expanding also this measurement of femicide, yes, indeed, EIGE has been part of it, and we have attended all the meetings, and our initiative is not yet, we don't want to duplicate the efforts or to have or to overlap. On the contrary, that we were kind of analyzing where the problems are in the identifying or collecting the variables that can be useful in order to operationalize this gender motivation. So we've been part of these consultations as well, and now what we are aiming is that to look in detail in only 7 EU member states and see how the data collectors can really identify these variables that from the experts' understanding are the variables that can unveil this gender dimension. So yeah, we want to contribute to UNODC UN Women Initiative and be part of it. Thanks for the question.
And 1 minute for Harriet and 1 for Christine. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add in answer to the questions that were just raised, so I can give the time to Kristen.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can just add a little bit about the COVID fears or the COVID types of violence. So we've done a little bit of work with service providers here in Australia, and the types, the calls go down during lockdown, but in between lockdown periods or when the things open up a little bit, then the helplines or the crisis lines increase calls. And the women are reporting different types of violence. So it's not so much that they're new victim survivors, but the types of violence they experience is different. And there's particularly a new category of COVID violence. So when a perpetrator comes home and goes out and says, oh, I've been exposed to COVID, and then sneezes on her, and then sort of building on that fear. So we've seen that type of fear building, or refusing to give her a mask. So the similar sorts of behaviors that you might see in violence generally are then adapted to things that are related to the fear around COVID. And in terms of public fear, then yes, there in some cases when women do go out and the environment is completely when there aren't people around because it's vacant because of lockdown measures, that there can be increased fear because there are some people roaming. But generally during that lockdown period, everyone's locked down, and so that's reduced. So the public violence has gone down. Being in Melbourne, we've got the longest rate of lockdown in the world at the moment, and we've seen a greatly reduced crime rate for other types of crime. With the reports to police for violence going up or escalating in the periods where the lockdown does release. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. And I invite you, if you want, to continue our discussion on the chat, so you can put your question and we all will answer. And thank you very much for everything. Thank you.